Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. It's me and JP today.
Yep.
Good to see you, sir.
The two buddies doing it.
This episode of the Health Upgrade Podcast is brought to you by Truvaga. Have you been looking for a simple way to feel calmer, think clearer, and sleep better? Imagine achieving this with just 2 minutes a day. I'm excited to introduce you to Truvaga, a handheld device that supports your nervous system through gentle vagus nerve stimulation. As a doctor specializing in functional health and wellness, I've seen firsthand how Truvaga has accelerated healing in my clients. I've used this device to help people with a range of issues, from sleep disturbances and heart palpitations to digestive dysfunction, nervous system imbalances, and mental wellness concerns. The results have honestly been remarkable. Truvaga is designed to catalyze and accelerate the shift in your body from fight or flight to rest, digest, and recover mode, helping you manage stress, maintain mental clarity, and unwind more easily. It's not just theory. I've witnessed its positive impact on real people facing real health challenges. The best part? Truvaga fits seamlessly into your routine. No need to carve out hours for wellness. Just 2 minutes a day can make a difference. It's a small investment of time for potentially significant benefits in how you feel and function each day. If you're curious to experience Truvaga for yourself, visit truvaga.com/upgrade. You can save $30 on your device by using the code UPGRADE30 at checkout. Remember, that's truvaga.com, truvaga.com/upgrade. It might just be the first step towards a calmer, clearer you, just as it has been for many of my clients. So we're excited about today because the topic of today's conversation and our episode is the glymphatic system, which to me is kind of the secret to brain health, to truly understanding how we maintain good functioning brains for as many years as we can possibly live. And when we turn on this system and utilize it more effectively, and we do certain lifestyle factors and we live in a certain way, we can utilize this system more effectively to ensure that our brains work more efficiently for a longer period of time. So we're going to get into what the glymphatic system is as we talk through this, and we'll try to do this as organically as we can. But I think this is an important topic for anybody who's dealing with cognitive dysfunction, anybody who's dealing with memory issues, anyone who's just feeling like their brains could work a little better. And we're going to provide some real practical insights into what you can do to improve brain function just from day-to-day activities and lifestyle factors. All right. So, JP, let's talk about, before we get into the glymphatic system directly, let's talk a little bit about this system and when it's most active. There's a certain time of day when this system works most effectively. And so let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's a great place to start because the glymphatic system is really active at night, or specifically when we're in sleep, and even more specifically at certain stages of sleep. The N3, which is the third of the non-REM sleep stages, also known as slow wave sleep, is when the glymphatic system is at its most active. That doesn't mean it's not active at other times, because nothing is quite so digital as it's off all the time, all other times, and then it's just turned on like a light switch. It doesn't work like that. But its really pronounced effects are during that slow wave sleep, that deep sleep stage that we're all looking for on our Apple Watches and on our Fitbits and Aura rings. That's the stage when the glymphatic system is at its most active. And interestingly, and sort of a hint as to ultimately, why it's active and when it's active, it's more active during early cycles of a night of sleep. So if you have a 7.5 or a 9 hour night of sleep, the first few stages really predominate with glymphatic activity and slow wave sleep, and the later cycles of sleep, sort of in the 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning kind of time frame, there's less glymphatic activity. Not that there isn't some, there's still some, but you start to see more REM sleep. That's where you're doing the memory consolidations and doing all the long-term potentiation of synapses and other things. So, and again, not that that isn't happening in the early stages of sleep, early cycles of sleep, but bottom line is that there's this balance, these two things that are going on during sleep. There's this waste clearance function, which is the glymphatic system, and then the memory consolidation and learning phase, or consolidating of learning.
I'm just going to pull back a little bit. So, for those who don't know about the cycles of sleep, just to bring it back to that quick point, we generally, as humans, should experience 5 sleep cycles during a full night of sleep. So, those 5 sleep cycles occur by going from an awake state down towards that deep sleep state. So, it goes REM to non REM, light sleep to deep sleep. So, the N1, N2 phases are what we call light sleep. uh, there's REM, then there's N1, N2, and then N3 and N4 is deep slow wave sleep. So generally, we have these 5 cycles of sleep, and we tend to experience the most slow wave deep sleep during the first 2 to 3 sleep cycles, and we tend to experience more REM and light sleep during cycles 3, 4, 5. So it's more deep early, more light and REM later. And so that kind of cycle or that pattern is necessary for how the brain functions and clears out the toxins, the waste products out of the brain in the early stages. And this is where the glymphatic system works most effectively. And then later on is where the neurons get to firing once again and get to memory consolidation and into these that's where the dreaming really happens, right? We tend to dream a lot more when we wake up a little early and we remember that dream. It's because we were in one of those slow wave or REM cycles. And that's where memories tend to be produced, and remembering what you were dreaming about occurs.
Yeah, there's a movement of information, if you will, out of the long-term memory that we store in the hippocampus, and actually we integrate it into the cortex. And the way I describe this to people is, if you've learned something new, let's say you're a new way of solving a math problem or something simple, you learn that during the day, and you go through a process of doing a few problems and started getting a handle on. For the rest of the day that you're awake, you understand it and you could do it, but not as fluidly and as you won't be as fluent with it as you will the next day. You go to sleep and the next morning you wake up and you're like, oh yeah, now I completely get that. Now it's easy. It's just part of who I am. And that's because during the night, that knowledge, that information, that new neural network orientation or organization has been transformed from your hippocampus and actually integrated, and it changes your cortex. So sleep is a really, really, really important part of cognitive improvement and learning and functioning, which is interesting because because you talk about those 5 cycles, that 7.5 hours of sleep that we really, really need to function optimally. And that's the key, functioning optimally. Because what happens is, during those first 2 or 3 sleep cycles, the each one being 90 minutes, so you're talking 3 hours to 4.5 hours. During that period, you're doing the critical um, short-term maintenance of the brain and clearing out the waste, because that waste is neurotoxic. So if you go without getting at least 3 hours or 4.5 hours of sleep, you'll literally die. I mean, it will kill you to not get sleep for most people. It's But you will not function well. Your brain and the cognitive things that you need to do will slowly begin to deteriorate unless you get those additional 2 to 3 cycles that get you up to 7.5 hours. And there was a great study that was done back in the early 2000s. It's referred to as the Belenki study. And what they did was they took groups of people and they subjected them to varying amounts of sleep per night for a 7-day period. So there was a run-in period of 3 days where everybody got 7.5 hours of sleep. And then for the next 7 days, they had, let's say, 4 groups. There was a group that got 9 hours of bedtime. was a group that got 7.5 and stayed there. It was a group that got 5 hours, and a group that got only 3 hours. And what they saw is that during that 7-day period, the group that got 9 hours was really no different than the group that got 7.5, showing that you really didn't need that extra. 7.5 was really good enough. And then the 5-hour group saw a steady decline in cognitive functioning, and they measured that in a variety of different ways, psychomotor vigilance testing, et cetera. And they found that that level of activity or that level of function dropped down to about 80%, 75 to 80% cognitive function, and sort of stayed there. The group that only got 3 hours per night steadily dropped to the point where they were about 70% deficient in cognitive function. I mean, truly to the point where they were effectively, inebriated, and hallucinating and incapable of functioning within just 7 days. And that is not a function of neurotoxicity or things like that that we believe. Although there might be some level of that. It was really a function of the fact that you went 7 days without memory consolidation and all the things that you need to do in REM sleep. So it's, and the amount of time it took to recover after doing that is pretty remarkable. The 5-hour people recovered mostly within about 3 days. But even 3 days following, the people who had only had 3 hours of sleep a night, even 3 days wasn't enough to recover. So it's it's an interesting dynamic is how the brain, the short term immediate concern is waste clearance, because the brain will literally be destroyed if not. But in terms of optimizing its function and maintaining its cognitive capabilities, that deteriorates if you don't get that 7.5 hours of sleep that we really need. Now, there are some people, and I think this is where we're going to tie it back to the glymphatic system. There are some people, and it's about 1 to 2, maybe even 3% of the population, who are short sleepers. These are people who do function with minimal sleep. In fact, supposedly, Donald Trump is a person who only needs 3 hours of sleep a night, and apparently he's lived like that for his entire life. Now, we're not going to get political. Some people might say, "Well, that explains it," and other people may say that's why he accomplishes what he does. But at the end of the day, these people may have, and they call them genetic short sleepers. There may be a genetic difference in how they clear the waste from their brains so that they don't need the waste clearance cycles of sleep because they're doing it during the day, which most people don't. And then they only need those 2 cycles of REM sleep to accomplish the memory consolidation that they need to be able to function, at peak performance. But let's dig into the glymphatic system um, and I think maybe we start by talking about how the body typically deals with waste. And you had a great quote about how the kidneys work and how other things in the body clear waste, which is
This is my favorite quote when it comes to understanding how we get rid of toxins within any area of the body is that the body's solution to pollution is dilution.
exact.
Whatever builds up, if we have a lot of toxin buildup, if we have a lot of waste product from metabolic processes, of course, there's going to be tons of that if you're metabolizing effectively or ineffectively. Actually, more if you're ineffective.
Sure.
What that does is it builds up this toxic burden, generally in the intracellular fluid. This is the fluid or the areas between cells where these toxins are essentially left. Like you can consider them almost like the trash bins outside the cells. And some of them are still within the cells, but you need to essentially think of a clearing system by which the trash is taken out from the kitchen, from the house to the garbage bin outside, and then for the garbage truck to come through and clear it out. The body does this utilizing specifically dilution. Dilution is done so using fluids to clear the toxins and allow for fluidity to essentially have replacement of these fluids that contain waste with clear, cleaner fluids that can eliminate that. So why don't we get into what that
So
is and
that's
the
how the
lymphatic.
kidneys. Yeah, that's how the kidneys work, and we call it, when your kidneys fail, you get a buildup of toxins. My grandfather ultimately passed, on my dad's side, passed from kidney failure.
Mhm.
He had an MRI with contrast back when contrast was um, could be damaging to the kidneys, and it did. It damaged his kidneys, and he went through having to go through dialysis regularly in order to survive, and finally just decided that he wasn't going to do it anymore. He was not in his 90s, and it takes about, a week or two to pass away, to die from that buildup of toxins. But the way the kidneys function and the way dialysis mimics that is, as you said, you have some volume of fluid with a buildup of toxins in it. And so what you do is, if you got a gallon of that fluid and it has a concentration of X of toxins, and you add another gallon of fresh water to it, well, then the combined amount of fluid has only a concentration of half X. And if you then take half of that water and get rid of it, well, now you're left with that same gallon of water you started with, but now you only have half of the amount of waste. And if you do that repeatedly, you're effectively constantly diluting away the pollution. As you said, the solution to pollution is dilution. And that's what the kidneys do. That's what dialysis does. And frankly, that happens everywhere in the body. Now, the brain sits behind the blood-brain barrier, and we're going to talk about what the blood-brain barrier really is. And so it needs its own dialysis-like system. And that's what the glymphatic system is all about. And it's a pretty fascinating system. But it all starts with, what is the blood-brain barrier to begin with? And we all talk about it. We say, "Oh, does this drug get through the blood-brain barrier? Has the blood-brain barrier been, has lost its integrity, and now you've got problems because you've had a stroke?" What the blood-brain barrier is you have blood vessels in the brain, bringing oxygen to the neurons. We obviously know that we need oxygen, but around the blood vessels are wrapped the what are called end feet. They're basically the arms, or we'll call them the legs, of a type of cell called an astrocyte. And this astrocyte has these long tendril-like feet that they wrap around the blood vessels. And they then serve as the gatekeepers as to what is going to get from the bloodstream into the brain. So they form a barrier.
Yeah. Just want to quickly add, astrocytes are a big component of the immune system in the brain. This is an important area. And so normally we have blood vessels in every area of the body that have our endothelial layers of capillaries. Like it's the cells that make up the lining of the vessels. In the brain, we have this additional layer that the immune system is there to ensure certain things get through and certain things do not, which is why we call it the blood brain barrier, because the brain is so important that any excess toxin, any excess uh, challenge to its optimal function needs to be eliminated or not able to enter the brain so that we can think more clearly. And so this is where the astrocytes come in, producing this additional layer of defense to ensure that only the good stuff gets in, or ideally in that situation. And so we've talked a lot about these immune cells in the brain. The astrocytes make up this barrier. What if there's an immune dysregulation that's going on in the brain? Could there be a breakdown in the blood brain barrier?
Absolutely, and that's what happens when we have infections in the brain, or we have, frankly, infections in our bodies. That's why you get this extravasation of cells from the bloodstream into the brain that can perpetuate inflammation, and that's why blood vessel integrity is such a big part, and just the size of the blood vessel. Are you in a vasoconstricted or vasodilated state? um, is important for pain. Headache pains and migraines are believed, at least in part, to be neurovascular problems. controlling that flow of things from the bloodstream into the brain. But these astrocytes and their end feet are wrapped around these blood vessels and preventing things normally in normal function from getting into the brain that shouldn't be. Now, what was discovered about just a little over a decade ago was the specifics of how that system of the astrocytes wrapped around the blood vessels also controls the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. And what it is that I want you to think of the blood vessel as an inner tube that's carrying the blood. And we've already said that the outer level layer is these end feet of the astrocytes that are sitting around that tube. But in between the blood vessel and those end feet is an area or a volume where cerebral spinal fluid flows. And what is cerebral spinal fluid? It's really just plasma and fluid that doesn't have cells in it that's come through the blood vessel wall into that area, into that volume. And basically through pulsatile motion of the blood vessels and um, some norepinephrine signaling and even ionic some electrical stimulus, there's flow of that glymph or that cerebral spinal fluid through these channels. Now, again, that's still separate from the brain because you've got these end feet that are controlling the flow of everything through that channel. Well, for a variety of different reasons, but principally for waste clearance, these astrocytes have on them specific channels that allow water or fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, to come out of those glymphatic channels into the interstitial spaces that we were talking about. As you said, that it's not inside the neurons, it's not inside the microglia, it's the volume of space, if you will, that's outside of the cells where you get this waste buildup. And you basically have your cerebral spinal fluid or what's called interstitial space fluid that's sitting in that area, and it's slowly getting more concentrated with waste. So just like your kidneys, the glymphatic system is pumping water or pumping cerebral spinal fluid out of the glymphatic channels into the interstitial space, diluting the waste and then recapturing it into either microglial cells that capture it, the waste and break it down, or back into the glymphatic channels for release into lymph nodes, et cetera, that are outside the brain. Now, there's some details that are really fascinating about how astrocytes function and the roles of norepinephrine and acetylcholine, and there's even studies demonstrating that vagus nerve stimulation has an effect, but we'll get to that. Um, but I think this system of glymphatic clearance of waste is so critical, and it explains why every every creature that exists on the planet has some form of sleep. Whether it's the sleep that we're used to, where we just literally, lose consciousness, or really interestingly, dolphins have this really neat way of sleeping where dolphins actually only have one hemisphere of their brain to go to sleep at any given time. So they have, one hemisphere is asleep and then the other hemisphere is asleep and then they're awake, which is pretty fascinating. But even plants go through relative cycles of activity versus inactivity. And so this idea of having a sort of um, uh, evolutionarily preserved cycle of inactivity versus activity is driven by this need to clear out waste. And then in the case where there's a nervous system, you have this need for consolidating memories and ensuring that the brain's functions, the cognitive functions, are optimized.
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding this concept of the cells of the brain, the neurons, the microglial cells, all of the cells that work together to create cognitive processes, they all require metabolic function to get their job done. Mitochondria need to be constantly active, producing energy. And if we're utilizing oxidative phosphorylation versus glycolysis, the amount of toxin, the amount of metabolic waste product that's going to be produced. And even importantly, you brought up infection. We have these potential, if there's an infection in the brain, if there's some sort of uh, inflammatory buildup, we have an excess burden of waste product that's going to be produced in certain areas. Concussion, brain injury is a huge other area where we build up a massive amount of potential inflammation and these waste products that need to be cleared out. And part of the reason why we have challenge to our cognition when we have a brain injury or concussion or an infection is because there's this excess of inflammatory waste product that is produced in these areas. We need to clear that out. And because the brain is so uniquely positioned within a smaller physical capacity, the cranium kind of maintaining a small space, any excess fluid buildup that occurs without replacement of clean fluid coming through is going to literally physically press the brain to not be able to function very effectively, right? We're going to have less physical space for the cycling motion of blood vessels and clearing to allow for the fluid to get cleared out and for the brain to function optimally.
You're
So the
talking about brain
clearing
swelling.
out.
You're
Yeah,
talking about
exactly.
brain swelling. Yeah, I mean that's you're absolutely right. And in fact, the ability to control that flow of cerebral spinal fluid into the interstitial spaces is I won't call it the holy grail, but it's the mission when somebody comes into the emergency room or into the ICU and they've got brain swelling. We've all seen on ER and other shows where they take off a section of the skull and you see the brain actually literally swelling out of the skull. That happens.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is figure out how do we prevent brain swelling. And I think the glymphatic system is a big regulator of that volume increase. And we know that in situations of a stroke or a concussion, you do see a weakening of the blood brain barrier, a sort of an opening up of that of the blood of the flow of fluid out of the blood vessels into those interstitial spaces. Now, the interesting thing is that it doesn't happen all the time. In normal, healthy life, as we're sitting here today, right now, talking, we're awake, we're conscious, we're speaking, we're thinking, all of those things necessitate that this flow of glymphatic fluid through our interstitial spaces is minimized. So the glymphatic system is not on all the time. Or let's just say we've dialed it down from 10. If you're in deep sleep, you're at a 10. Well, it's dialed down to about a 1. Okay. Maybe there's 10% of the glymphatic flow that you would otherwise have during deep sleep when you're awake. And the reason for that is that the synapses have neurotransmitters being transmitted from one side of the synaptic cleft to the other. Well, the synaptic cleft has cerebral spinal fluid in it. I mean, that is outside of the cells. It's sitting in that interstitial space. There's fluid there. That fluid, if it's constantly moving and constantly being diluted, then the residency time, the amount of time that a neurotransmitter will spend in that synaptic cleft is variable. I mean, it's not controlled. But if you shut down that system, minimize its flow, then you have a much more stable environment for the neurotransmitters to exist in that cleft. And so during consciousness and when we're awake and we're problem solving, especially when we're super stressed, there's there's this need to shut down the system. Now, what neurotransmitter is associated with not only stress, but just being alert, being conscious, being awake? It's norepinephrine. And so norepinephrine has the effect of effectively clamping off or slowing down, shrinking the size of that glymphatic flow, that region where the flow is happening, and shutting down those aquaporin 4 channels for bringing that fluid into the brain. So when you're awake, a combination of things, all regulated in part by norepinephrine, limits the activity of the glymphatic system in order to maintain like really high fidelity activity in the brain.
And just a quick reminder, norepinephrine is also the primary neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system in the rest of the body.
Which
So
is
norepinephrine is necessary. We need it for cognitive attention, ability to focus, clear thought, but it also drives us into a state of more stress, more fight or flight. Now, we want that. I think the sympathetic nervous system gets a very bad rap for being the thing we don't want to experience. I disagree. We need to experience sympathetic drive. We need norepinephrine to allow us to think clearly, to remain active, engaged, focused, but it needs to cycle out. And this
Mhm.
is the difference between awake and asleep. This is the difference between active and resting. This is the difference between engaged and being in a calm, restful state. Let's talk about cycles because cycles play a massive role in the ability to shift to low glymphatic flow, optimal cognitive function through the day, and then optimal recovery processes because we've cycled out of that because we've now dropped norepinephrine at night and increased acetylcholine and increased melatonin function in the brain and the rest of the body through the night. And this cycling is really what helps drive glymphatic flow to be optimal.
Yeah, acetylcholine is obviously the primary neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system, and we call parasympathetic activation sort of the rest, digest, and restore mode. We should probably call it the rest, digest, sleep, and restore mode because that's what we're doing when we're in healthy, restful sleep. And I want to distinguish that from sort of that fretful, sleep that you get when you're super stressed and you're not really getting that. The reason you wake up feeling still tired is you still have the sleep pressure.
Mhm.
That's what we call it, sleep pressure. That as you get more and more tired at night, that the sleep pressure is building. You still have that sleep pressure because you didn't go through what you needed to in terms of the clearance and the memory consolidation. So the cycles really are very much tied to your autonomic nervous system, and you want to be, as you said, it's really healthy to stress yourself briefly, for short periods, and in a controlled fashion. But when you get to the point where you're chronically stressed, well, that leads to chronic norepinephrine presence. You're impairing your glymphatic clearance. So it's actually toxic, it's neurotoxic, but you're also increasing and altering the metabolism that's happening in the cells. You're generating more waste, and so this buildup that's occurring, you get tired. That's why stress tires you out. We find ourselves fatigued as a result of chronic stress. We also find ourselves chronically tired, even in the morning, even after a night of sleep, because we never got the clearance that we needed. And so the waste products are building up. It leads to neurodegeneration over time. Why? Because we said it's toxic. It's actually killing the nerves. The environment is not functioning optimally. And with vagus nerve stimulation and other things that you can do, deep breathing techniques and meditation, you can help to clear that and make your sleep restful so that you can clear out that waste. Now, the interesting thing, and part of what I'm doing some work to study right now is there a way to enhance that glymphatic flow during the day? Because as you can imagine, if you're a person, for example, if you're a resident in a hospital in the emergency room, I mean, think about it from that perspective because
Mhm.
that's kind of scary. Okay, there are careers that require, and I'm going to put require in air quotes here because they really don't, but you know what we're doing is we're taking people. Let's say you're going to become a resident in some field in medicine. You're going to go into the hospital and you're going to be working 36-hour shifts, up for 48 hours. That's what these guys are talking about. And they're doing it day in, day out, day in, day out. They are putting themselves through a chronic sleep deprivation state. And think about it, these people are supposed to be learning.
Mhm.
This is the time when they're supposed to be, taking in all this information in these experiences and training their brains how to function in these circumstances. And we are literally doing it in a way that is minimizing the effectiveness biologically of being able to do that. So that makes no sense. Then there's been a large push to make certain that residents are getting more sleep, and there's been pushback from the old guard who said, "Well, we went through it. You should have to do it too." But the truth is, one of the leading causes of death in the United States, and frankly, I think in the world, but one of the leading causes of death in the United States, especially for people under the age of 65, in fact, I think it is the leading cause of death, is medical mistakes, made in the hospital, made, by physicians, and they don't mean to do it. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that somehow we've got a, a slew of healthcare providers who are actually mass murderers, but they're so prone to making mistakes. They say that a person who lives on 6 hours of sleep or less for 1 week is equivalent to a person who's functionally drunk. So we have people who are functionally drunk taking care of us in the most critical circumstances because they haven't gotten enough sleep. I mean, it's we see it on TV shows and dramas about healthcare and hospitals, but this is a real problem. And so one of the projects that's going on, and in fact, there's a big push for this, is okay, now that we sort of have a better understanding of what sleep is there a way that we can manipulate our systems so that we can accomplish what we need to in terms of waste clearance and glymphatic clearance and glymphatic flow during the day without making our cognitive functions when we're awake impaired simply because our synapses aren't functioning properly? Is there a way to do that so that we do need the memory consolidation function to take place at night, but we only need 3 hours of sleep? Is there a way to make it so that we could have 3 hours of sleep and get functionally what we need all the way up to
Right.
the equivalent of 8 hours? And that's an exciting project that's in development right now, and I'm happy to say that I'm actually part of it, and I'm excited to see how it plays out.
I would love to see how that plays out because it'll provide some real insight into how we can optimize our functionality and really live more thoroughly. I think that's so important to understand. One of the pieces of information here that I think we are aware of already, and we've talked a lot about it on numerous episodes of the podcast, is the effect of exercise. And I think this is one that I'd love to kind of dig into a little bit with you to talk about how exercise, movement, activity levels, not sitting for 12 hours a day when you're awake, actually translates to improved glymphatic fluid and lymphatic system function in the body. So I'll quickly talk about the difference here. We've got outside of the brain, in the rest of the body, we've got what's called the lymphatic system, which is what we've got our blood flow, which takes blood to all of the tissues, to all of the organs. These uh, the blood doesn't leave the blood vessels, but bits of fluid do. A little bit of what's included within blood needs to get to all of the cells so that those cells can get the sugars, can get the fats, can get the amino acids into their cellular space so they can create new proteins to utilize the fats and the carbs to produce energy, and then to produce whatever their output signaling molecules are. When they complete that metabolic process or that the entire process of that cell, there is going to be some metabolic waste product. In cases where we're bringing in a higher carbohydrate diet, more processed foods, more sugars, we're going to be producing more metabolic waste. in a situation where we have more efficient use of these metabolic processes, something like a ketogenic style or higher fat diet where oxidative phosphorylation is working far more effectively, we're going to produce less, but we still will produce waste. That waste needs to be taken out of the cell because it hinders cellular function. So it gets pushed into that intracellular space known as interstitial space fluid or interstitial fluid. That fluid needs to get cleared out from those tissues. Movement, literal physical movement is required to pump that fluid, the interstitial fluid, out of those tissues into spaces that we know as lymph nodes, or these areas where there's accumulation of these interstitial fluids that then lead back to the blood. Okay, and that is how the lymphatic fluid works. Movement is the key to this entire system working. If
That's
we
why people get
sit,
you start swelling.
exactly. If we sit, and I'm sure everybody has experienced it to some extent. Like if you're sitting on a flight for more than 5 hours and you get up and your feet are a little swollen or your legs are swollen, or we've all seen people walking around at amusement parks or at the mall with their legs very swollen. This is a sign that they're not clearing that interstitial fluid effectively because the motion patterns that are required to pump that fluid out are not happening effectively enough. That's a really important thing to understand. It's motion that creates this. In the gut, it's peristaltic motion and migrating motor complex. We have these processes occurring even when we're fasting. We still have motion in the gut to clear the fluids, to make sure that the microbiome is being cleared out in the lumen of the gut, but in the actual cellular areas in the lining of the gut, that pumping fluid needs to happen, or the pumping of that interstitial fluid needs to occur all the time. The kidneys are constantly in this pumping fluid motion, right? The lungs are constantly in this pumping fluid motion. Every organ in the body does this, but certain organs require some help. And that help comes from skeletal muscle. We have this area where skeletal muscle actually pumps fluid more effectively. And the legs is where we tend to notice in the lower legs, below kind of the knees, we tend to notice the swelling far more. The reason for this is literally gravity. When we have gravity pulling downwards, keeping our feet on the ground, fluid tends to pool down there. And if we don't utilize our skeletal muscles, the skeletal muscle pump mechanism of pushing this interstitial fluid back up from the legs up into the lymph nodes in the legs and pushing back into the venous fluid pump, the veins can't even pump that fluid back up more effectively, and that leads to even greater swelling and expansion of those tissues. So muscle movement is absolutely key to this. While we are continuing to create this motion pattern utilizing our legs, so getting up and moving every hour or going for a walk after a meal, like a 30-minute gentle walk is enough to help to produce this fluid motion. While we're
There's another piece of it too,
Yeah, go
which
for it.
is that, and you're absolutely right, that exercise in the moment is serving as the pumping mechanism to pump that interstitial fluid or the lymph through the tissue to clear out that waste, bring it back up into the, to the kidneys and other ways of excreting it. But the other thing that it does over a longer period of time, because this is actually where I thought you were going with the importance of exercise, is that mitochondria, that we talk about them. They're the power plants of the cell. That's where this metabolic waste is coming from. Okay. And we can talk about diet, and you already sort of introduced that concept, so we'll hit that in a minute. But mitochondria themselves recognize the demand that's on them. And if you're sedentary and you're not moving, there's not a lot of demand. And so they get lazy. They don't reproduce. They function in sort of a, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say a sort of half-assed way. They just don't do their job well. Okay. But when there's demand on them, they recognize it and they reproduce. They reproduce either through a process called biogenesis, where they literally, like a bacteria, they split and there's a new one, and that fissioning process is really important, or they optimize their function by maintaining a certain size. And so they sometimes come together and they fuse or they separate based on the demand that you need. And their ability to do that, to split, to reproduce, and to come back together, that ability to do that is a function of how well you are maintaining your aerobic health. How well are you processing oxygen in your system? VO2 max is an example. So exercise is critical, not only acutely for pumping the lymphatic fluid and potentially glymphatic fluid, although that's still an area of study. But with respect to mitochondria, it's not. I mean, it's very clear that you want to minimize the amount of waste. So think about it. If we just said that the brain during the day, when you're conscious and you're doing things, you're producing some level of metabolic waste because the brain is a huge energy sink. We use a tremendous amount of energy in our brain. 20% of the energy of our whole body is used in our brains. So we're creating the maximum amount of metabolic waste in our brains. Okay. Compared with anywhere else in the body, that's the waste central. If we have a very clean engine that we're running there and we're exercising and maintaining that optimal mitochondrial function, it minimizes the amount of waste. But also, what fuel, you mentioned this before, what fuel are the mitochondria using for energy? What are the neurons and the microglia and the astrocytes, what are they using for energy? If they're using sugars, if they're using carbohydrates, if they're using highly processed carbohydrates, if there's trans fats or other things that are in your system, those things can damage the ability of those mitochondria to function efficiently. And if we are in a stressed state, what will happen is the mitochondria will not have the level of the antioxidants. We had a whole episode about glutathione. We probably should have whole episodes about superoxide dismutase and catalase and melatonin. We've talked about many times. If you're in a stress state, you're not producing a not high enough level of those antioxidants. And as a result, you're going to produce more waste and more damage and more things that need to be excreted or secreted out of the cells into the interstitial fluid as waste. So what you want to do is you want to make certain that those mitochondria are maximally efficient and that they're minimally waste producing. And how do we do that? Well, the ketogenic diet you talked about is absolutely one, but we want to rely. The body is such a wonderful machine. We have our liver producing when we have low levels of insulin and we have low levels of carbohydrate and sugar in our system. Our liver will mobilize, through signaling, will mobilize fat and bring those fatty acids into the liver and convert them into ketone bodies. And ketones are it's like the purest fuel. That's the fuel that when your brain uses it, minimal waste product produced and maximal antioxidant levels produced. And so that's why, people who have, we talk about clean living, if you're living in that ketogenic state, you have literally the ability to stay up longer. You need less sleep, and that is a fascinating thing for people who want to be able to function optimally, and have to be in an environment where they're working really, working strange hours or long hours. That ketogenic diet can really be helpful for you in that, and making certain that you're getting exercise. Interestingly, the body itself doesn't require anywhere near the amount of sleep that our brains do.
Mhm.
Our brains are the requirement for 8 hours or 7.5 hours of sleep. Our bodies probably don't need much more than just periods of rest.
Yeah. There's a big
We
difference between physical tiredness and mental tiredness.
yeah,
Right? And like your body can function with less sleep. You can get up, you can physically do all of the things that you need to do, but your brain may not function at that highest level if you're getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. Your brain is not capable of completing the task. So mentally choosing to be disciplined, mentally choosing to make specific conscious choices when you're in that sleep deprived state, that's far more difficult than the physical burden of not sleeping for that
Yeah.
many hours.
In fact, as I said, I'm sure that there's some level to which lymphatic flow is enhanced during sleep. There's no question.
Yeah. And I
But
think exercise and where I was going with it eventually was to the mitochondria. I'm glad you brought that up. But also, as we do the exercise, as we increase blood flow through the body, because the role of exercise is to make sure that we're getting the blood flow to the areas that require it more effectively. What that does, and you brought this up with how the mitochondria adapt to the certain situation. If you're not moving, if you're less mobile, if you're literally not utilizing them, they're not going to be effective. But they will adapt to the situation where when you do become more active, they will adapt. The mitochondria become more adaptable in the same exact way the blood vessels become more adaptable. And when the blood vessels in one area of the body become more adaptable, it happens everywhere. It happens in a diffuse way. So if blood vessels in the legs are more functional and more efficient, the blood vessels in the brain are more efficient. And so that blood pumping mechanism of blood vessel function in the brain increases. And what that does is it supports the CSF and extracellular fluid drainage to occur more effectively elsewhere. The two biggest things that you can do to optimize glymphatic system and lymphatic system fluid motion is sleep really effectively and exercise. Those two things, without a doubt, have been proven to reduce the toxic waste load in the brain and the body. That is, I think, the biggest take home from what we're trying to get across to
you
everybody.
you mean you mean diet, sleep, and exercise are really important? Wow,
Imagine that.
that is groundbreaking news right here. You heard it first on the Health Upgrade podcast. Diet, sleep, and exercise.
I
No,
can't
I
believe
mean,
nobody else is talking about this.
no, and it's a fascinating topic that I think is, um, we're learning so much really, and there's still so much to learn about how the glymphatic system works. I mean, there's questions about, okay, now that that waste material has been diluted out, where does it go? And what is the role, what is the roles of microglial cells in orchestrating what's happening with the astrocytes? I mean, we know that in the inflammation state of microglial cells has an impact on everything. I mean, frankly, on astrocytes expressing those aquaporin 4 receptors, the localization of those aquaporin 4 receptors or channels on the surface of the end feet. How does that signaling alter the interstitial volume? We didn't talk about this, but one of the aspects of this glymphatic system that's really important is that during the day, not only are the channels smaller, but the interstitial space itself, the volume of interstitial fluid is reduced because the astrocytes actually change their size. They become bulkier and they're sitting and they're holding everything in place without there being a lot of fluid. So not only is there's a lot of waste, but there's not a lot of fluid. Okay. And then you have this change of state where the astrocytes sort of shrink in size. The end feet shrink, the vasculature is constricted, and you have this larger volume in the glymphatics in channels and more interstitial volume. So you can it's like you go from having a cup full of cerebrospinal fluid to gallons. You know,
Mhm.
obviously those aren't the exact quantities, but you get the image. There's so much more volume for that waste now to be diluted. All these things are still, we have a sense as to what's going on, but it's all still being elucidated as we speak.
One of the questions I have on this is what's the role of hydration, electrolytes, making sure that you're getting enough fluid in, making sure that you are taking in this really clean fluid, filtering your water, making sure that there aren't constant toxins making their way in. This is a real question for a lot of people, right? We, especially with even we were talking a little bit, we're not getting political here again, but we know that the Make America Healthy Again kind of one of the big things that they're bringing up that RFK is talking a lot about is fluoride in water.
Mhm.
We know that there are neurodegenerative effects of excess fluoride consumption that do take place. We see IQ points drop between 5 and 7 points in areas that have high fluoride input in kids, which is crazy. But imagine if we're not taking in good, clean fluid and we're getting these excess toxins in, the body is not burdened with those. Like, of course, the body and the brain are going to be burdened with even greater toxic burden and toxic load. We're really excited. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be having a lot of great guests on the podcast. And one of them actually she just sent me her book, so I'm excited to read it. This is Dr. Ailey Cohen, wrote Detoxify, all about the everyday toxins that are coming in. I've got it in my hands for those who can't see. But this is a great book that talks about the toxins that are entering and what we can do to detoxify. And the glymphatic system is a major piece to this puzzle, specifically with regard to brain function.
Yeah,
And
just yeah, the hydration piece is really important, and athletes will know.
yeah,
In fact, I remember seeing it on the wall of, I think it was in the movie Moneyball. It was something on the wall talking about the fact that when you're dehydrated, your athletic performance drops dramatically. Okay, so we know already that it drops athletic performance. It makes you more tired. You feel fatigued. But the other thing that it's doing, and we've talked about this before, and I know I always talk about it when I explain to people things that they can do to enhance their parasympathetic tone, is hydrate yourself, because it actually is one of the driving things of autonomic stress. Okay, it may not be, you're not, it's not like a deadline or something like that, but when you're dehydrated, your autonomic nervous system is shifting into a sympathetic state. And so if you go to sleep dehydrated, it's probably one of the reasons why when you go to sleep after drinking alcohol, you have a lousy night's sleep. Well, I mean, think about it. We talked about it with Nayan Patel. It's
yeah,
literally eliminating your glutathione. It's increasing your sympathetic nervous system state. That's going to reduce glymphatic flow. You're dehydrated. I mean, the combination is just, it's literally the worst thing that you could do, short of, like, eating a bullet. I mean, it's just a terrible thing that you can do to your brain is drinking. I'm sure the alcohol industry is going to, send
oh, they
hitmen
love
out,
it.
but that's the truth. Alcohol is really terrible for your system. And you can see it. Your heart rate variability drops like a stone. Your deep sleep goes to zero. All of these things are negative, are having such a negative impact on your brain.
You just connected a dot here, but if alcohol drops deep sleep, and deep sleep is where glymphatic fluid and glymphatic motion is at its greatest in that N3
Mhm.
state of sleep, imagine now we're dehydrated because of the alcohol. We're now decreasing glymphatic fluid and we're pushing our body into a sympathetic state. And that's showing up on your HRV being completely tanked when you are inebriated. So this is it's a full circle moment here that you're not even allowing your body to enter a state where that healing process can occur. You're not even allowing it to eliminate the toxic burden of normal day-to-day processes, but then you're burdening it with further toxin with alcohol.
One of my really good friends uh, was just lamenting to me, because he's an attorney. He said that nights that he goes out with clients and he has a couple of drinks, he says it takes him 2 or 3 days. He's enough in tune with his body. It takes him 2 or 3 days to get over just having a couple of drinks, cognitively, physically, just how, his fatigue levels, all of it. I mean, it's days. Is it really worth it? I mean, I think, it's I've noticed that there's a surge online, and maybe it's just me, but there's a surge online of non-alcoholic alternatives to cocktails, and I encourage people, consider it. I mean, there's some stuff out there that, like, it tastes pretty good, and there's things like kava and some mushroom-based things that will give you a little bit of a buzz, but it's not dehydrating you. It's not altering your cognitive functions, and it's not disrupting your sleep. And to the extent that you can maintain your ability to sleep and get into that parasympathetic recovery mode safely and easily is critical. Alcohol is not doing that.
No question. No question at all. Yeah, we've harped on this. We don't need to dig into it as much anymore. We've harped on this topic quite a bit, but it's an important one for people to understand, right? If you're truly looking to upgrade your health, alcohol doesn't do it. Like it's literally the opposite. So
Yep.
take
And
that
it's not only
what
aging.
you need it to be.
I think on that episode, I said alcohol. If you could literally distill, no pun intended, all of the things that alcohol does down into just a cup, it's aging you, and it's aging your brain. And as I said, all of the things that we're talking about in terms of getting the waste clearance and the memory consolidations, if you don't do that, you are aging your brain. You're exposing your brain to neurodegeneration. So, I mean, it's not a surprise that chronic alcoholics have all sorts of brain degenerative problems. You can see on the MRIs of their brains, they've lost massive amounts of volume of their brains as a result of chronic drinking. Alcohol will ultimately degenerate your brain.
It's equivalent to multiple concussions. It's equivalent to things like CTE. It's equivalent to literally trying to break your brain down with physical and chemical intent, which is really sad.
Yeah,
I feel like we've covered most of this. Let's kind of just summarize for everybody
sure.
the role of the glymphatic system. Let's provide some final practical tips outside of the exercise and sleep that we've kind of already talked about. What are the tips that we can provide to help people optimize glymphatic system function?
Sure. So, as we've talked about, sleep, you really need to try to get 7.5 hours of sleep, unless you're one of these very lucky genetic short sleepers. You want to get at least 5 cycles of sleep. That seems to be what everybody needs and will maintain you at peak performance.
I'm
The
a big
first
fan of sleep tracking for this
Sure.
because then you know when you wake up that you've hit 5 cycles. And it's once you understand how to read an Aura Ring or Whoop Band or Apple Watch or whatever tool you're utilizing, once you know how to read those sleep cycles and understand that you're getting 5, then you know what it's like to wake up. And now I naturally wake up having hit those 5 sleep cycles generally right before 6 a.m. and I feel great. That's my routine because I've done it for so many years and I now know it very clearly what I need to do to optimize that 7.5 hour, 5 sleep cycle pattern.
Absolutely. And those first 2 or 3 cycles are where that slow wave N3 state of maximum glymphatic flow is so critical. You're doing the waste clearance. The next, you know, 2 to 3 cycles that you get are where the focus really is around memory consolidation and learning. Now, what we didn't talk about, but we sort of touched on it, is that all of this is controlled to a certain extent by your inflammation state in your brain.
Mhm.
The introduction of sleep, that sleep pressure that we talked about, that when you get tired towards the end of the day, what's happening is that waste buildup is triggering an inflammatory response. Your microglial cells are sensing that waste buildup, the toxic burden that you've now got, and it's pressuring you by making you tired to go to sleep. It's driving you into that state of sleep. So, one of the things that vagus nerve stimulation is being used for is to enhance alertness. It's so fascinating because it will, by reducing the activity of those microglial cells, that inflammatory activity, it actually allows you to stay up longer if you need to. It reduces the sleep pressure. It doesn't prevent you from falling asleep because it's also enhancing your acetylcholine levels and decreasing your norepinephrine levels. So it puts you into this state, and I think we all actually probably love this state. It's that Saturday afternoon state that you're sitting in where there's no stress, where you're just daydreaming and thinking, and you're in, you can think clearly, you're not tired, but if you sit down in a chair and you put your head down, you're going to fall asleep and you're going to have a nice nap. Okay, so that's the state that vagus nerve stimulation can get you into, where if you need to be up and functioning, you're crystal clear. If you want to fall asleep, you can fall asleep and get into that deep sleep and function well. And so that's a function of those microglial cells and being able to modulate them with vagus nerve stimulation. So one of the things I would say for people who haven't used vagus nerve stimulation, you can vagus nerve activation, you can do it with deep sleep and cold water plunges. I mean, sorry, deep meditation and deep breathing techniques, etc. You do those things, you are going to see on your Whoop band or your Aura Ring or your Apple Watch, you're going to see that you're spending more time in deep sleep. You're enhancing that glymphatic flow, but you're also maybe going to reduce the amount of sleep that you need because during the day, by downregulating that stress, downregulating that inflammation, you're actually going to have some level of glymphatic flow that's going to clear out that waste more effectively during the day. And that ultimately, for me, would be a fantastic goal. If we could figure out how to trigger ourselves to be able to have that glymphatic flow regularly, during the day so that and it didn't disrupt cognitive functions because obviously that's what's happening for people who have this genetic short sleeping gift. If we could do that, then I think we could really, survive on less sleep and still not suffer the consequences.
Absolutely. So sleep is huge. Understanding that we need to lower the inflammatory burden and decrease the microglial activation that is occurring, or the drive towards that M1 hyperactivated, sympathetically driven microglial cell. Absolutely. Exercise, we know we talked a lot about the effects on both the mitochondrial function side and improving mitochondrial efficiency, utilizing carbs and fats more effectively, ideally fats and ketones, getting the mitochondria functioning at the most efficient and effective manner. But in addition to that, improving muscular function and improving the pumping ability of these blood vessels being the ultimate end goal by which the lymphatic fluid is drained into again, so that we can pump out the toxic burden and pump in the good, clean, nutrient dense blood into the brain, into the muscles, into the other tissues, so that we can think clearly, feel more calm, and ultimately provide the nutrients for each cell to do the job that it needs to do. So exercise plays a massive role, and it doesn't need to be doing CrossFit 24 times a week. We don't need that much, right? We're not all elite level athletes, and we know that elite level function and performance requires this at a higher level, and it requires this to occur at a greater level. For the general public, for the general person, movement numerous times a day, mild movement, going for a 10-15 minute walk twice a day or 30 minutes, or just getting up and doing 10 squats from your desk every hour is going to make a massive difference in the functionality in these blood vessels, in the muscles. It's going to improve your overall function. I walk up and down the stairs a couple of times in between my calls to make sure that I'm able to pump my muscles and get moving, or I'll go for a walk on a nice day, right? This is a way to, in the middle of your day, include this exercise or this movement pattern to provide that exercise pattern and support not just glymphatic, but lymphatic fluid
Absolutely.
motility as well.
And I'm probably in need of that advice myself personally because I tend to go on a very long run in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'll do a shorter run. Um, but there's a lot of evidence, and you see it on social media. They were talking about in fact, Dave Asprey just had a post about this, that you are healthier if instead of doing 10 miles in one run, you go out for 10 1-mile walks during the day. Now, obviously, that's a lot, but that that is the ideal thing, is to do something every hour, and that's goes back to what my Galloway technique for stress management and for being more productive is take those last 5 minutes of every hour of your day and break yourself away from whatever you're doing that's stressful or otherwise has you sedentary, get up, stretch, do a couple of deep knee bends if you want, do some squats, walk around, talk to your spouse or your friends or whatever, and make, do something fun, and go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, get something to eat, so you downregulate that autonomic drive of sympathetic activity, and do it every hour. It's not enough to do it just, once a day and then sit for the remaining 12 hours. That's not the healthiest way to do it. It's good, but it's not the healthiest way to do it. The healthiest way to do it is to break it up over the day and continuously do it. And of course, that's how we evolved. That's the lifestyle that we had for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, and our ancestors had for millions of years. So this modern society of get up, get in the car, sit in the car, drive to work, walk in, sit in an elevator, stand in an elevator, sit at a desk for 8 hours, 9 hours, and go home and have a couple of drinks and go to sleep. Not not what God intended.
It was the opposite of what we're intending to do.
Exactly.
And then the last thing that I want to bring in is dehydration and hydration, and ensuring that you are hydrating effectively. Remember, this one quick big line from today is the body's solution to pollution is dilution. And in order to dilute the toxic burden that is present within your body, the metabolic waste products and other toxins that might be entering, you want to ensure that you're hydrating, that you're getting in good, clean fluid, ideally filtered water, providing some electrolytes in that water, providing the right salts, the right minerals to ensure that you have optimal balance within your body. Each person's going to have a mildly different preference to sodium and potassium and magnesium to get into the cells or into the water, and preference on taste. Do your best to ensure that if you're using electrolytes, that they don't have a ton of sugar and a ton of other additives, that it's a good, clean electrolyte powder. Find a good, clean one. There's a couple of brands that I'm a big fan of. Redmond Relight is one of my absolute favorites. I really love that one. Some people really love Element. Not a huge fan of how salty that one tastes, but for some people it's great. There's great options out there. So find an option that works for you that is not full of sugar. I think that's an important one to take home, because that's just adding not only caloric burden to you, but it's full of sugar, which is, as you know, from anybody who's listened to this show in the first place, sugar is kind of the problem here. We know that it's not doing any good for anyone.
Understatement of the show. It's kind of a problem. Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
kind of a problem. And making sure that your water is filtered so that it doesn't provide excess toxin entering the body as it does. But hydration is absolutely key to optimizing performance, brain health, and glymphatic system fluid function.
100% agree with that. Couldn't end on a better note. Hydration is key. It will literally just, I carry a bottle around with me, of water every day. I mean, all the time. It never leaves my hand. My kids laugh at me, and I look at them and think, like, this is a life lesson I hope you ultimately absorb from watching me.
Absolutely. My kids take their water bottles to school with them every day. I'll throw a little bit of salt into it just to make sure that they have some electrolyte balance. But this is a key thing that is missed out a lot, and cannot be understated just how important good hydration is.
Completely agree.
Wonderful. Well, I think this is a great place to end our call today, and to share this wonderful information with regards to how to optimize brain health utilizing glymphatic system, sleep, exercise, hydrate, and give your body a chance to not have too much inflammation occur within primarily the brain, but everywhere within the body. And you'll be able to get this system working as well as possible. And ideally, we'll have some wonderful new research to share in the coming months and years to get out to everybody as to how to optimize and upgrade their glymphatic system. All right. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with one person who you think could utilize this information to upgrade their brain health and their overall health. And we would also love it if you could go on to your podcast platform, wherever you listen, whether it's Apple, Spotify, and rate us. Give us those 5 stars. Let us know what we're doing well. Throw some comments out there. We'd love to hear some topics that you guys are interested in that we can talk about, some guests that we can have on. Please feel free to share some options out with us. We're excited about the next many months where the podcast is growing significantly, and we want to get more information out to more people so that we can truly go out and upgrade everyone's health. Thank you all for listening, and we'll catch you all on the next one.